There was once an empire which was so successful we spent thousands of years trying to emulate it. An empire which forever made its mark on the world. The legacy of its government and legal system influences edifices of state and laws even today. However, over the centuries, this empire, Rome, was over-mystified, its story ever so slightly altered in the public consciousness to fit ongoing narratives and political agendas, and became the subject to the right-wing culture war nonsense. Hi, I am Kane, and today I wish to talk about the myth of Rome, why Rome was a deeply flawed system that was institutionally doomed to stagnate and decline over the centuries, as well as debunk some common narratives surrounding its eventual demise. And of course, this is a great excuse to talk about the fascinating history of Rome, which I am a great fan of, and only with a bleeding heart will I do nothing else but shit on it for the rest of the video. Yes, I will now talk about the terrible aspects of Rome. No, this is not a personal attack against you. If you like Rome, I like it too. And if we both like it, we should not be afraid to challenge the popular narratives around the empire. For the purpose of this video, and because these are the most commonly known parts of the empire with their associated myths, I will mostly focus on the period between the early republic and the fall of the Western Empire in 476. This will also tie into a general loose series I am in the process of making that aims to debunk myths about the authoritarian systems of government that still persist today and often serve sinister agendas. Because authoritarian systems were, are, and will be inferior. Romaboos and right-wing culture warriors always like to point to the Roman Empire as the greatest thing that the West has ever created and its collapse as the greatest tragedy ever, going on and on about the effectivity and virtues of the Roman Empire. Everybody is at least vaguely familiar with the Roman Republic, its downfall, the rise of Caesar, or Kaiser, because I will use the original name, fuck you, the golden age of the Roman Empire and its eventual decline and fall. I will assume that you, dear viewer, also have some familiarity with it, so I will not run through the entire 2000-year-old history of the empire from the kingdom to the fall of Constantinople, or even longer if we consider its successor states, and instead focus on what is relevant to my topic today. Now, there are many arguments in the strictly intellectual, professional, and in no way biased and ideologically charged halls of internet forums and social media about what caused the eventual collapse of the western part of the empire, many trying and, in my opinion, miserably failing to draw a parallel between that and the state of today's Europe and United States of America. Sorry, Canada. First of all, in my opinion, it has to be established that both Golden Age Rome and collapsing Rome are interlinked with each other. By that I mean that the problems that eventually caused its decline were already deeply present even in such periods as the Five Good Emperors, for example. Don't misunderstand me. The institutions of Rome were some of the best of its time at that specific region, and even replicating it was a task too hard for Western Europe's post-collapse societies. I'm not trying to dispute how well oiled the machine the Roman legions were, or how the law system was so advanced. However, I am not trying to sell it for more than it was, and it must be said that the system was deeply flawed. I know, heresy, right? Now, before you leave an angry comment and tell me how much of an idiot I am, please let me explain my point and cast judgment then. There were a lot of factors which brought down the empire, so many, so varied, and filled so much to the brim with worthwhile academic debate that I will obviously not be able to cover all of them here, so I will try to strictly focus on the institutions and the events my topic and point is linked to. After all, no single factor or even event caused the decline and collapse of the Roman Empire. Now first, let's examine the Republic. The Roman Republic was not a democracy as we understand it nowadays. However, some aspects of it are still used today, as it did carry elements of direct and indirect democracy. In Rome, most political influence was held by powerful noble families who usually held most of the offices, had the means to be present in the assemblies, and through a system of patronage greatly influenced the voting of others. In the Roman system of patronage, wealthy and powerful people became the so-called benefactors of lower-class people through bribes, support, and advancement, and therefore greatly influenced how they voted. It must be mentioned that elected offices in Rome were generally not paid positions, which meant the officials also had to have a significant personal wealth to begin with. However, retired officials did often get assigned to positions that paid, like proconsuls who got to be governors of provinces. To grossly oversimplify the Roman Republican government, which you must keep in mind existed for several centuries and changed a lot during this time, people were placed in different groups based on social standing, tribe, and military age in several different assemblies. First, I have to talk about how voting and election worked. Initially, only male citizens who resided in Rome had the right to vote, but citizenship was greatly expanded through the existence of both the Republic and the Empire. Though offices were generally not restricted to class, the tribune of the plebs had to be a pleb obviously, but anybody could become eligible for consulship, the highest ranked official in the Republic for example. However, the system was very heavily biased in more ways than one towards ruling families, and most offices and elections for the majority of the Republic's history were dominated by the wealthy elite. Now, even with its inherent biases, Rome does have to be given credit that all male citizens were technically enfranchised, which is a level of enfranchisement not achieved by most of Europe until the late 19th century. The assemblies were held in Rome either on the Campus Martius or in the Forum Romanum, places that could not accommodate all who could vote in the first place. The place of the assemblies also meant that only those could participate who either already resided in Rome or could afford the journey to Rome, which meant abysmally low turnout rates even during the most contested elections. And as the Roman state expanded, more and more citizens found themselves so far away from the ancient city that they had absolutely no chance at exercising their voting powers. Originally, the vote in the assemblies used the method of open oral voting, meaning that if you wanted to vote for a candidate or a law, for example, you had to stand up and openly proclaim your support of that law or person. This, as you may imagine, was prone to abuse, so it was changed relatively early into a remarkably modern secret ballot voting method, which you also do if you live in a democratic state when you go into the ballot box on an election day. There were several assemblies called comitias and a council, concilium, beside the Senate. There were the comitia curiata, the comitia centuriata, the comitia tributa, and the concilium plebis. The comitia curiata was the principal legislative body of the kingdom and the early republic and was organized around the curiae, the original aristocratic clans of Rome. Roman patricians eligible to vote gathered here and were presided over by a high-ranking magistrate, like the consuls, who were the only elected magistrate during the early republic, or the Pontifex Maximus, who had immense power over everything concerning both religious and legal matters, especially in the early days, as the priestly class was the original people who did legal things, as laws and religious practices were often intertwined. Violating laws, especially laws concerning the state and protection of magistrates whose office was sacrosanct, were considered sacrilege and an offense against the divine. This assembly elected the magistrates of the early republic, like the two consuls, for 1-year terms each, through which it was guaranteed that no one man can hold too much power, passed laws which were binding to everyone even though it had no voting power afforded to the plebeian class, for example, and acted as a judicial body in certain cases. It lost most of its power in the mid-republican period to the comitia centuriata, and its use became more or less symbolic, but still kind of relevant, given that this was the assembly that technically held the authority to bestow and revoke imperium, essentially ultimate state authority, that certain offices like the consular office and similar magister maiores held, though it did remain the main judiciary body over clan matters. The second, and for most of the Republic arguably the most important, is the Comitia Centuriata. It was the gathering of military-aged men aged between 17 and 60. The Roman military was organized into so-called centuriae based primarily on wealth. The wealthier an individual was, the higher their centuria was. Though a centuria is often translated for company in English, these groups were usually much larger than around 100 men. Nominally representing all Roman citizens, it enacted laws, elected the highest magistrates, including the censor and the consuls, handled war declaration and peace, and presided over higher crimes. It was usually led by either a consul or in a few cases the praetor, Rome's highest legal official. Members of the centuriae didn't vote as individuals in the assembly. Instead, each centuria had a single vote exercised by members of a centuria voting amongst themselves, and the option gaining the most votes becoming the single vote of the said centuria. Because the centuriae were organized by wealth, and because wealthy people had disproportionate ability to be present, there was a clear class divide during the voting, and wealthy aristocrats and members of the equine class held disproportionately large power in the assembly as a result. Having the right to vote first and often voting as one bloc, they usually had a clear majority together and could easily outvote the poorer classes representing most of the Roman citizenry. The third assembly was the Comitia Tributa, which represented the tribes of Rome. Tribes are people living in a set geographical location and was the most democratic of the Roman assemblies. Just as with the centuriae in the Comitia Centuriata, each tribe had one vote, and that one vote was decided by members of said tribe by picking the option most voted for among themselves. It elected most lower-ranking magistrates like the equestors and the audiles curules, called magister minores, who had no imperium. This assembly was also a judiciary body over lower crimes. It was presided over by either a consul or the praetor. The concilium plebis was a gathering of the plebeian class that was also based around the curia system, except it specifically represented the non-aristocratic citizens belonging to these clans, while the comitia curiata was specifically the aristocratic assembly. It was originally not afforded much power. It elected a few plebeian offices, legislated rules that were only for the plebeians, and presided over legal cases of the plebeians. The Roman Senate had a veto over its decisions, and it was one of the least important legislative bodies in Rome until the plebeian secessions that led to the expansion of its power. Which led to the plebiscitums, the original laws that were made by the plebeian council that only applied to the plebeian class, to be applicable to everyone in Rome. It elected most importantly the tribune of the plebs, who also presided over the council, whose position became stronger especially towards the late republic, when they held absolute veto powers in matters of law and state, and the concilium itself was also immensely strengthened in power. Of course, we have to talk about the Senate. Many viewers might be surprised to hear that the Senate's formal powers were not that extensive, especially during the kingdom period. It was little more than an advisory body for the king, though it did elect new kings when the previous died, and in the early republic it held very little actual power. At least initially, and on papyrus, or wooden tablets, or metal tablets, or whatever. Now, the Roman Senate in the Republican period was basically a so-called Council of Elders. Its members were all previous state officials who, after serving their terms and having the necessary moral and ethical qualification, became senators for life. Being a senator was also not a paid position, by the way, and after becoming a senator, the individual was barred from certain important business practices without Senate approval, so people seeking to become senators usually already had to be wealthy. As a result, it was dominated by the patricians for most of its existence, though a lot of wealthy plebeians and equines became part of the Senate as time went by, and wealth was little less a patrician's privilege. The Senate held several important powers, but I will focus on four. First, it issued the so-called Senatus Consultum. Primarily, it was some advice on laws and actions of magistrates, but in practice rarely was it disregarded. If a law landed in the Senate and it voted to disagree with it, it was usually dead. Similarly, they consulted with magistrates and directed their actions through these decrees, and because of that, the Senate was a huge roadblock for any reform, and its grip on power was only weakened after the reforms of the Gracchus brothers and the adverse reorganization of republican institutions by the guy named Sulla. God damn it. The second, it controlled the treasury. Without a Senate, there was no budget, quite an unfortunate turn of events for any aspiring head of state to find themselves in, especially when they want to reform or start a public project. The third was its ability to work on foreign relations and declare individuals and entities the friends or enemies of Rome, thereby tightly controlling republican foreign policy. By the way, this was exactly what Caesar has violated during his Gaul campaign that made him into the enemy of Rome eventually. The last one, that in the case of emergency it appointed a dictator for a short 6-month term, during which the individual elected exercised near unlimited authority. This institution existed to protect the republic from existential threats, though in the end this very institution became the republic's downfall. The Roman Republic was an entity that endured for nearly 500 years without much civil strife compared to many contemporary governments. I do have to mention what I think are some of the most important but often overlooked events in the history of the Republic, those being the plebeian secessions. During these, popular uprisings forced the aristocratic elites to gradually give way to more democratic reforms and allow the plebs to participate ever more in day-to-day politics. The Republic's institutions, though unequal and often giving way to corruption, did represent a stable and powerful state, which by the end of its existence dominated much of the Mediterranean. Its advanced legal system ensured a smooth transition of power and the ability to contain most disagreements within the chambers of legislatures and courtrooms. These institutions, though open to abuse and full of bad faith actors, did gradually give way to reform for the lower classes. However, since many core issues were never solved thanks to it disproportionately favoring the elites that blocked the efforts to solve them, corruption and discontent eventually collapsed the Republic and gave way to the shit show that was the Roman Empire. Oh boy, I'm going to be trashed for this, aren't I? I mean, why not? Is it even allowed to say anything bad about the Empire at this point? Well, I digress. Before we get into the Empire, it must be noted that the more successful periods of it were heavily influenced by republican institutions that were kept in place to ensure support and legitimacy for the princeps. It took centuries of corrosion and disenfranchisement under decadent and tyrannical rule for these to completely erode, upon which both imperial instability and the rise of essentially proto-divine right absolutism heralded the fall of the Western Empire. The greatest weakness of the Empire was exactly its system of personal rule by the Emperor. Rome collapsed not for a single reason like barbarians, natural disasters, or specific internal events. It was slowly collapsing under its inability to ensure continuity of government and a variety of crises through the centuries, coupled with the ever more powerful and organized actors both internally and externally who were less forgiving every time the empire tripped and fell flat on its face. One of, if not the most important thing for any government is to ensure smooth transition of power from one to another, because the consequence of failing to do so causes civil war, collapse, and anarchy, and the Roman Empire utterly failed to do so at every turn throughout its history. Though the Republic was a flawed system, it ensured that the new magistrates were elected, sworn in, then left office on a regular, legally enshrined, and commonly accepted and enforced basis. The empire was born out of a succession crisis after the death of Caesar, as his potential heirs squabbled over the territories and resources of the state, and it continued this trend all the way to the fall of Constantinople. The late Republic, of course, had its fair share of problems, especially as the violent resistance by the elite entrenched in the system and fiercely against reform, and the increasing destitution of the Roman plebeian class caused social upheaval, while the state that was designed around a single city was overstretched with new conquest, which eventually allowed Caesar to build popular support. Just to name a few important wars directly tied to succession and power struggles. Caesar's Civil War, the War of Mutina, the Liberators' War, the Sicilian War, Marcus Antonius' war against Octavianus, Year of the Four Emperors, Year of the Five Emperors, the entire clusterfuck of the 3rd century, the Tetrarchy Civil Wars, Emperor Honorius' Civil War with its 4 other siblings in the early to mid-5th century. And these are just the wars that Rome fought against itself. I'm yet to mention the hundreds of other political schemes, minor secessions, murders and usurpation attempts that happened, not to mention all the wars it fought outside. Between Augustus and Romulus Augustulus, nearly half of all Roman emperors were assassinated. To talk in detail about all of them is to condemn myself and you, dear viewer, for a video series, each episode several hours long. You'd like that, don't you? In the present example, you can see the gap between the Year of the Four Emperors and the Year of the Five Emperors. That was basically Rome's golden age, where most squabbles over leadership was settled in-house by means of murder, imprisonment, and relationship to Caesar and Octavianus Augustus. Though Rome, for most of its history, managed to operate a sophisticated and robust bureaucracy and legal system, its ability to manage its territory declined sharply as the centuries went by. The truth was that corruption was an integral part of the Roman state, be it the sponsor system through which the rich and powerful controlled the vote and advancement of the plebeians, the unequal institutions in place that benefited the aristocrats, the rampant bribery of officials that was actually a more or less accepted practice for a long time, not to mention the Praetorian Guard, which murdered several emperors, demanded regular bribes, and even sold the empire to the highest bidder at times. You look at this shit and tell me it's fucking functional, because I do not think it is. But I digress. Now, where was I? Yes, back to Rome. So, societal decline in Rome can be easily spotted at several points in history. During the late Republic, for example, small farmholders and veterans were displaced by larger estates and cheap slave labor, forcing hundreds of thousands of them into the city for odd jobs and creating a huge cost of living crisis in the process. It's not that people didn't want to reform things, but they were either killed or exiled in the process. This created the perfect environment for people like Caesar to build a large popular support out of the dispossessed hundreds of thousands. We can also look in the late Empire, where out of the dispossessed rural poor they invented serfdom to solve labor shortages after plagues and wars have severely depleted Rome's population and economy. A genius idea, if you ask me, to tie millions to the land and not allow them any social or economical mobility at all. But Roman Empire, am I right? Yay! Now, with all of that out of the way, let's talk in a little more detail about the Empire, and I think I will start with the most prosperous age of the Empire, called the Principatus or Principatus period, that stretched between Emperor Augustus and lasted until the crisis of the 3rd century. During this era, the emperors, or in their unofficial title, the princeps, the first man, implying that their person is first among equals, and this is where the name comes from, they strive to preserve the illusion of the republic. Among other things, they did this by keeping many of the republic's institutions, including the comitias, the magistratus, and even elections. The caveat was that the power of these institutions was cut way back, and over the period of 2 centuries basically disappeared, giving way to the Dominatus period, in which the emperors grabbed absolute power over the state. Again, it is not that they didn't try to fix these problems, but every attempt missed the fundamental problem of the empire, which was its inability for a peaceful transition of powers between emperors and governments. A prominent example of how they try to fix this might be the Tetrarchy of Diocletianus, during which he introduced a 4-way system of power sharing. In the system, there were 2 senior emperors known as Augusti and 2 junior emperors known as Caesares. In the event of the death or abdication of one of the Augusti, their junior Caesar would take their position and choose another Caesar for themselves. The empire was also regionally and administratively divided between the 4, with both Augusti and both Caesares taking direct control over a part of the empire. The system might sound good on paper, however, the moment Diocletianus retired, the entire thing collapsed as different factions and even legions proclaimed for different Caesar or Augustus. It resulted in a civil war that again greatly weakened the empire, because violence is the #1 ruler in a dictatorship, and it doesn't matter how you want to circle around it, anyone with a big enough armed supporter base can make a play for the throne. Like Diocletianus himself became emperor through means of violence. The imperial economy also suffered through the centuries, from inconsistent tariffs and taxes to a constant debasement of currency as a means for emperors to bolster the constantly empty treasury, leading to hyperinflation. There were several cost of living crises and worker shortages from the numerous wars, economic collapses, famines and plagues, which led Constantinus I to enact legal reforms that essentially tied the small free farmers, called the colony, to the land, that basically created medieval serfdom and made social mobility for large parts of the population essentially impossible. It also didn't help that politics and the military were so interlinked that any governor with sufficient resources can just muster the troops and march on Rome. They attempted to separate administrative and military careers by the dox system, where the governor was no longer the supreme military commander of the legions in that specific province, but it did not tackle the fundamental problem of corruption and personal loyalties in the army. The constant internal strife didn't restrict itself to just squabbles for power by the elite. Rome also suffered under its own way of existence. Being an expansionist power that subjugated a lot of peoples, naturally faced problems when these peoples constantly rebelled against them. This included such bloody affairs as the Bar Kokhba rebellion and the Kitos War, both so severe they reshaped the demographics of 3 continents, ushering in changes that echo even today. Not to mention the slave revolts, the religious strife caused by Christianity, and the numerous other affairs that it had to face throughout the centuries. Rome, though, ran persecution campaigns several times in its history, Christians were particularly hard hit. The persecutions always destabilized society, caused chaos, loss of life and resources that Rome could ill afford. Another issue was, since that only a small number of people were actually holding citizenship, the possible pool of manpower for the empire was limited compared to the masses of people it ruled over. Though they made remarkable progress to alleviate this problem, first by giving all of Italy citizenship, giving auxiliary troops citizenship, and then eventually enacting the Constitutio Antoniniana in 212 by Emperor Caracalla, which gave every free man citizenship. Which is funny in my opinion, because Caracalla hated the lower classes, but I guess that inheritance tax that only was paid by the citizens sweetened this undoubtedly sour apple for him. It was sadly not enough to stop the empire from falling into the crisis of the 3rd century though. To talk briefly about the crisis of the 3rd century that I keep alluding to, it was around a 5 decades long time between 235 and the ascension of Diocletianus. It naturally started with a series of succession crises that led to the so-called Barak emperors, meaning a line of emperors who were generals that used their military power to forcefully seize power. This eventually led to the empire breaking into 3, of course. Coupled with a series of plagues and foreign powers rising up in war, it nearly broke the empire. The Antonine Plague, as it was called, killed millions, and coupled with a well-placed drought that ravaged the agricultural sector, they plunged the economy into the red, all the while emperors, to pay their troops and the customary bribe to the corrupt Praetorian Guard, constantly debased the currency that caused severe hyperinflation. And, if this was not enough, hostile tribes and empires started invading as a cherry on top of this whole crap cake. Though Roman armies ruled the field of battle, their enemies were far from complacent. They either started taking on the Roman way of war or developed new tactics which avoided open battles against the legions. The army also weighed massively on the treasury, regularly eating up 60 to 80% of the imperial budget. This is just to pay the army and keep it running. The constant wars, both internal and external, were extremely expensive for an army of that time, especially one that was so sophisticated as the army of the Roman Empire. Because of this, not much remained for anything else, and constant tax hikes and alternative sources of money were required by the state to just simply stay afloat in its day-to-day dealings. This was also a recurring problem even outside of the crises. Eventually, Diocletianus pulled it all together, just for things to go sideways the moment he retired, leading to a series of civil wars in the Tetrarchy, though I already talked about that. Here, I would like to speak in a few words about the common myth that is sometimes used as a parallel comparison to some of today's contentious issues, which will be that migration of large barbarian tribes caused the downfall of the empire. Those who preach this don't know how the Roman state worked in the first place. Rome, through most of its history, practiced a relatively high degree of tolerance and multiculturalism to keep the empire together relative to the time. This was also something many successful empires practiced in history, like the Persian Empire. Also keep in mind that the notion of race and nationality didn't really exist back then. They frequently assimilated the beliefs of local peoples, mostly tolerated and left peoples of other faiths alone, who didn't follow the Roman gods, and allowed tribes to settle in the border regions, where they would enjoy the benefits of Rome and tax breaks in exchange for protecting the border against hostile incursions. Because migrations happened through the entire history of Rome, not at just the end of it, so pointing it as the singular reason why it fell is really redundant in my opinion. Yes, this might sound exactly the opposite of what I have talked about not long ago, but keep in mind that large persecutions were relatively rare in the empire, and it was usually the habit of the emperor of the day. Long history, stuff changes, they were usually the more weak and chaotic periods of the empire anyway. Allied troops escorted Roman expansion from the early Republic into the late Empire. Socii and Foederati troops in the thousands accompanied the legions. They bolstered the army with their numbers to such a degree Rome probably wouldn't have survived as long as it did without them. Remember, the empire often faced labor shortages, either because of war, plague, or organizational issues, so fresh manpower was something they always appreciated. Were they without problems? Obviously no, and they were just as subject to the political machinations of the empire as everyone else. But pointing to them as the singular reason why the empire fell is to completely ignore all the other underlying problems the empire faced, including that probably the legions and the civil wars that Romans caused to each other was probably more of a reason why the empire fell. Ooh boy, that might be a can of worms I am under-equipped to open. But let's continue. Now, with hitting towards the other side, no. Bureaucratic corruption was also not the singular reason why Rome fell. In fact, as I mentioned at the start of the video, there is no singular reason why Rome fell, and the closest to it is probably its inability to guarantee steady and peaceful transition of power and its ramifications. The Roman state, just like any ancient and, well, modern state, had problems with corruption, sometimes a level of corruption that is mind-boggling to imagine. But it did carry on for centuries. Its roads were eventually paved, and its officials, soldiers, retirees were paid at an astonishing efficiency, given both the corruption and the constraints of communication at the time. In spite of its constant state of crisis and inability to ensure stable governance and transition of power, it is remarkable that Rome managed to endure as long as it did. For its long history, few powers could really exploit their weaknesses, but its constant lack of recovery ensured that unless something changes, the empire will collapse. And the West did eventually. In its place, new powers rose, who actually kept a lot of the Roman institutions in place for a while after that. They adopted the laws and customs, even implemented reforms, and often respected the privileges of the previously Roman population. In fact, this is kind of the precursor time before the whole of Europe basically decided to try to LARP as the Roman Empire or its successor state, or model itself after the Roman Empire. And also, well, the Dark Ages were not as dark as many may imagine. However, these things are not in the scope of this video. Maybe in the next. We shall see. Now, before the end, I wish to speak a few words about the Eastern Empire too. Today known as the Byzantine Empire, though through its history always referred to as the Roman Empire. To make it short, the economically more advanced East managed to survive the collapse of the West thanks to their decoupling from the falling other half of the empire, which meant that the West didn't bring down the East with it. Though this decoupling was not that complete, given that trade and diplomatic relations continued, however, it was a much weakened state after that and spent a lot of its resources on impossible vanity projects, like the attempted reconquest of Rome, which weakened the empire and allowed forces to swoop in. It also took on an even more terrible court politics, which regularly ended in murder, political schemes, succession crises, and civil wars. Well, this is where the term Byzantine court originates from. It was also forced to reform its military to the theme system, localizing most of its forces, only keeping a small professional corps which strengthened the power of the local lords and magistrates. Though they had their moments, Rome could no longer afford itself constant civil strife, as there were far more powerful forces around it that could challenge them. Wars with Persia, for example, and its attempt at retaking the West left them weakened, then the Caliphate and Turkic nomadic tribes absolutely destroyed them. The Fourth Crusade was one of the final nails in the coffin, which absolutely should have ended the empire right then and there, and it did not. Thanks to some clever political maneuvering and a bucket load of luck, they miraculously managed to come back together one last time and survive another miraculous 200 years before finally losing to the Ottomans. Rome has a long and incredible story, however it must be treated right and not glorified to the point of no longer resembling reality. I have deep interest in Rome, and I like its history, and obviously I focused on the less than optimal qualities. It is still a fascinating history, and the empire's achievement definitely impacted the rest of European history, as everybody got inspiration from their architects, institutions, and legacy, for which nations would squabble for centuries after. This video specifically focused on its failures. I already know that there will be comments about how I left out things and stuff, but this video specifically focuses on its fault and myth, not the merits. Long videos could be made about the merits of the empire. I do not feel I attempted to or did take away anything from those merits, or from you for that matter. Please continue to enjoy this fascinating history. I'm always happy to know that people take interest in history. If you enjoy my content, like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, I was Kane, and I'm hiding in your walls.